June 1944. Normandy, France. The press conference had been going for 40 minutes. Reporters from a dozen countries had asked General George S. Patton about strategy, about logistics, about the Germans, about Eisenhower. Standard questions, standard answers. Then a young reporter from a small American newspaper raised his hand. Patton pointed at him. "General Patton, you walk upright under fire when other men crouch. You visit the front lines personally when commanders stay back. You've been in combat for 30 years. The reporter paused. "Are you afraid to die?" The room went silent. Other reporters stopped writing. Military aides exchanged glances. Everyone waited. Patton looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not his public smile. Not the performance smile he used for cameras and speeches. Something quieter, more honest. Like the question had unlocked something he had been thinking about for a very long time. "Son," he leaned forward. That is the first intelligent question anyone has asked me today." And what he said next would reveal more about who George Patton really was than any battle he ever fought. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the legend. To understand Patton's answer, you need to understand his relationship with death. It was not what you would expect. Most soldiers fear death. They manage that fear. They push it down. They compartmentalize it. They do their job despite it. Patton was different, not because he was braver than other men, but because he genuinely did not think about death the way other men did. His relationship with it had been forming since childhood. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California. He grew up in a family obsessed with military history. His father read him Caesar and Napoleon. His grandfather had died commanding Confederate forces in the Civil War. From the time he could walk, Patton was surrounded by stories of men who had died gloriously in battle. For him, death in combat was not something to be feared. It was the proper end for a proper soldier. The worst thing he could imagine was dying in a bed, old, sick, forgotten. He wrote about this, often, in letters to his wife Beatrice, in his private diary, in poetry. Yes, Patton wrote poetry, something most people don't know, and much of it was about death, about what happens after, about whether a soldier's soul moves on to fight again, because Patton believed in reincarnation, sincerely, completely, not as a metaphor, as a literal truth. He believed he had been a soldier in every great war in history. He had stood with Alexander the Great at the gates of Persia. He had marched with Caesar across Gaul. He had ridden with Napoleon through the streets of Paris. In one poem he wrote, "Through a glass darkly." So as through a glass, and darkly, the age-long strife I see, where I fought in many guises, many names, but always me. He wasn't being poetic, he was being literal. This belief shaped everything about how he approached battle. If death was just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, then what was there to fear? By the time World War II began, Patton had been shot at, shelled, bombed, and nearly killed more times than he could count. World War I, North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He had watched thousands of men die. He had held dying soldiers in his arms in the field. He had written letters to the families of the dead. And through all of it, his relationship with death had not become fear. It had become familiarity, like an old adversary you have faced so many times that you no longer flinch when you see him coming. The reporters in that room in Normandy knew the public version of Patton. The ivory-handled revolvers, the polished helmet, the speeches about glory and war. What they didn't know was the private version, the man who cried when he visited his wounded soldiers in field hospitals, who memorized the names of men who died under his command, who kept a private list of every soldier in the Third Army who had been killed. That man also had a philosophy about death that he had been refining for 30 years of combat. It had three parts. The first part was acceptance. Patton genuinely believed that if a bullet had your name on it, there was nothing you could do. And if it didn't, there was nothing to worry about. He had seen too many careful men die and too many reckless men survive to believe that caution made any real difference. He used to say, "The time to take counsel of your fears is before you make an important battle decision. That's the time to listen to every fear you can imagine. When you have collected all the facts and fears, make your decision. After that, put your fears aside and go ahead. The second part was usefulness. Patton believed that fear, if it existed at all, should be put to work, not suppressed, not denied, but converted into energy, into aggression, into the forward movement that kept soldiers alive better than hiding ever did. He had observed in 2 world wars that the men who froze in fear died more often than the men who attacked. Not because attacking was safer, but because movement was harder to kill than stillness. Because aggression disrupted the enemy. Because the offensive took the choice away from death and put it back in your own hands. The third part was the most personal. Patton believed that a soldier's death had meaning only if the soldier had lived without holding back. He had no patience for the idea of surviving a war by avoiding it. He used to say that he pitied the man who missed a great war. Not because war was good, he knew better than anyone that it wasn't, but because the test of battle, the absolute confrontation with your own fear and your own limits, was something that could not be replicated anywhere else in human experience. And a man who had never been truly tested had never truly lived. This was not bravado. It was not performance. It was a philosophy that Patton had earned through 30 years of watching men face the worst moments of their lives. And he believed every word of it. The young reporter in that room didn't know any of this. He had asked a simple question. Are you afraid to die? He expected a simple answer. Something about duty, something about country, something about the cause. What he got instead was 30 years of thinking compressed into a few minutes of absolute honesty. Patton looked at the young reporter for a long moment. Then he began. Son, let me tell you something about fear. Every man who has ever told you he wasn't afraid in battle was either a liar or a fool. Fear is not the problem. Fear is normal. Fear is appropriate. Fear is your body telling you that something dangerous is happening. The room was quiet. No one was writing. Everyone was listening. The question is not whether you're afraid. The question is what you do with it. He stood up, walked around the table, the way he always did when he was working something out. I have been afraid, more times than I can count. The first time I was under artillery fire in the last war. The first time I watched a man die next to me in combat. The first time I had to send men into a situation I knew some of them wouldn't come back from. He stopped, looked directly at the reporter. But here's what I learned. Fear is like a wave. It comes at you, and you have 2 choices. You can let it knock you down, or you can ride it. The men who let it knock them down get killed, not always, but often, because fear makes you hesitate, and hesitation in battle is the most dangerous thing there is. The men who ride it, who take that fear and turn it into aggression, into speed, into the attack. Those men live, not always, but often, because movement is harder to kill than stillness. He walked back to his chair, sat down. Now, you asked me specifically if I'm afraid to die. He paused. No. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because I believe that I have been a soldier in every great war since men first picked up weapons. I have died before, many times, in many places, and I am here again. He said it simply, without drama, like he was reporting a fact. Death to me is not an ending, it's a reassignment. And I'll tell you something else. The death I want, the death a soldier deserves, is not in a hospital bed, not sick, not old, not forgotten. I want the last bullet of the last battle. I want to go out the way soldiers go out, doing what I was made to do. He looked around the room. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not having lived enough to make the dying mean something. The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room. The young reporter sat there with his pen above his notepad. He had not written a single word. He hadn't needed to. The irony of George Patton's death is one of the great ironies of history. The man who wanted to die in the last bullet of the last battle. The man who had survived 30 years of combat, 2 world wars, dozens of battles, thousands of artillery shells, died in a car accident. December 9th, 1945, 4 months after the war ended, his staff car was hit by a military truck on a road outside Mannheim, Germany. Patton was the only one seriously injured. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He spent 12 days in a hospital, unable to move, dependent on nurses, unable to command anything, exactly the death he had feared. On December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. He is buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army who died under his command. He had asked to be buried with his men. That request was honored. When Beatrice, his wife, was told how he had died, she said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He didn't get the death he wanted, but he got the burial he deserved, among his soldiers, where he always belonged. The young reporter who had asked the question in Normandy published his account of that press conference in a small Ohio newspaper. It was picked up by 3 other papers, then 10, then 50. By the time Patton died, it had been read by millions. People weren't drawn to it because of the military philosophy. They were drawn to it because of what Patton had actually said underneath all the philosophy. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not having lived enough to make the dying mean something. That sentence had nothing to do with war. It had to do with every human life. Every person who has ever wondered whether they were spending their time on the right things, whether they were being brave enough, whether they would look back at the end and feel they had held nothing back. Patton answered the reporter's question, but in answering it, he asked a harder one. The one we all have to answer for ourselves. Are you living enough to make the dying mean something? Let us know in the comments what you think Patton's answer meant to you. And if you want more World War II stories that show the truth behind the legend, make sure to subscribe. You're in Patton's Army now.